Okay, we can get started. You're good to go.
Okay, perfect. Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, everyone, wherever you are joining me from in the world. I hope you're doing well and enjoy the holidays. And I'm really happy that you're here with me today for this 20th session of STEM Quest 3.0. My name is Amirali, and today we're diving into something that sounds artistic, but is actually deeply biological, and that's creativity. And more specifically, how to enhance it using neuroscience-backed techniques. Now, before we even start, I want to set the tone with one idea, and that is that your brain is built for creativity. It's not some rare talent that only creative people have. The same way that we're born with the machinery for language and the capacity for intelligence, we're also born with the neural architecture that is required for creative thinking. It's an inherent property of the brain. The issue is not that we lack creativity, we all have it. Most of the time, it's that we just don't know how to access it, protect it, and train it so it shows up consistently when we actually need it. And that's what we're doing today. I'm going to walk you through 5 major tips, and I'm not talking about fluffy, be creative advice, but very real brain-based approaches that help you become more naturally creative more often and in a way that feels less forced and more authentic. So a bit about me. I'm currently a neuroscience undergraduate student at the University of Washington in Seattle in my sophomore year. I grew up just north of the border in the beautiful city of Vancouver, Canada, and I'm originally Persian with some Turkish roots. So I've always been exposed to different languages and cultural patterns, traditions and perspectives, which has really trained me to think in connections and remixes, for lack of a better word, which is basically at the core of creativity. I love writing, music, football, playing the piano, going to concerts, hanging out with friends, exploring new places and trying new things all the time. And that last part actually matters a lot in creativity, because again, creativity is not just an artistic trait, it's a mental strategy for expanding what's possible in science, in entrepreneurship, in relationships, in leadership, in problem solving, and in literally anything you can think of. And this past year especially, I've been exploring the neuroscience of different kinds of creativity. So musical, visual, literary, etc. But today in this STEM Quest talk, I want to come back to creativity with a more direct mission, and that is, how do people upgrade it intentionally? How do we train the circuits in our minds so that creativity isn't a rare moment of inspiration, but is something that shows up because we've built the right conditions in the brain? We'll explore all of these today. Other than that, I'm the founder and executive director of Youth STEM Initiative, which I founded in August 2023. I presented at the past 2 editions of STEM Quest, and I'm excited to present for you again at our 3rd and largest one yet. So let's set the foundation. Creativity is one of our greatest cognitive superpowers. There is absolutely no doubt about it. And most of us don't really recognize how powerful it is until we notice what creativity actually does. It pushes the boundaries of what's possible. It's how we get scientific breakthroughs. It's how we get new art forms, new technologies, new solutions, new ways of thinking. But creativity isn't one single thing in the brain. There are many different neural circuits involved in different forms of creativity. Some specialized, some overlapping, and that overlap is actually very important because it means that creativity is not isolated. It's integrated across systems, just like memory is, just like imagination, attention, emotion, and executive control are. Now, here's the key idea that I want you to hold on to. Because these creativity circuits are literally wired into your brain's architecture, you can actually train them. Ta-da, what a surprise. You can strengthen the patterns that produce insight. You can cultivate conditions where your brain starts generating ideas almost automatically without you needing to consciously think about them, where creativity becomes less of a struggle and more of a default mode that you can enter. And today, The first major gateway that is something that sounds lazy, but is actually just a neuroscience cheat code, really, is mind wandering. So I'm going to introduce you to mind wandering. My first tip for you is super simple, but very underrated, and that is to stop forcing your brain to be productive every second. Let your mind roam. Let it rest into its own internal thoughts, because that's where some of your best ideas are hiding. There's a brain network that becomes especially active when you're not focused outward, and that is the default mode network, or the DMN. And the DMN is basically your brain's internal world building machine, where daydreaming, imagination, reflection, mental simulation, they all take place in this network. And here's the important part. That aha moment that people associate with creativity often happens when you're not actively trying to solve the problem. It tends to show up when you step away, when the brain shifts into a more internally oriented mode. And that's not random. There's a reason for it. More specifically, the DMN includes region in the brain like the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, which are all highlighted in this fMRI image of the brain taken from the sagittal and transverse planes. And it's activated when you're off task, meaning that you're not locked onto external simulation or stimulation. During these quiet mental windows, your brain starts doing something very powerful, and that is that it starts to retrieve memories, it builds hypothetical scenarios, and it combines them in ways, it combines information in ways that normally stays separate from each other and doesn't intermingle. So suddenly you get an insight that feels like it came straight out of nowhere. And that's not magic. That's your brain recombining distant concepts in the background. So how do you activate your DMN in real life? The DMN loves low stimulation environments, situations where your body is occupied, but your mind isn't overloaded. That's why some of our best thoughts happen on things like a walk, in the shower, while you're doing the dishes, while you're doing laundry. These are repetitive motions and demand minimal focus. It's like the brain finally has space to breathe, so it starts doing high-level internal work on its own. When your brain enters this mode, it starts pulling from different domains, whether that be personal memories, random knowledge, imagined futures, and it integrates all of these into new combinations. It's basically constructing ideas behind the scenes, and you might not even notice it until suddenly you think, wait, that's it, and the idea just hits you. So practically speaking, what do you do? Take breaks from focused work every 1 to 2 hours, and I repeat, do not replace these breaks with your phone. Go for a short walk, do a quiet task, let your brain clear out the noise, and keep a notepad near you, because your brain starts generating ideas unexpectedly, and you need somewhere to catch these ideas. You don't want them to just drift away and then you never note them down anywhere. So the notepad is absolutely crucial. Try a microdose of mindfulness, like 2 to 3 minutes during your breaks. And this helps calm neural clutter and makes internal signals clearer. And yes, light chores do count. Washing dishes, doing the laundry, as I mentioned before, these are repetitive movements with low cognitive demand, which makes your creative engine wake up. Also, let your mind roam before sleep or right after waking up. These transitions are naturally DMN friendly. And if you want something extremely direct, free write, doodle, without judging what you're actually producing. This uncensored input is a direct path to idea generation, and it's very simple. Now, what to avoid? High stimulation traps. Social media is the worst one because it hijacks your attention and floods the brain with novelty as well as cheap dopamine and other stuff. Also, avoid brute force thinking where you stubbornly attack a problem using just one rigid method. Why? Because this ineffective method of thinking blocks flexible association, limiting your brain's versatility and its ability to connect between different concepts. Finally, avoid constant task switching, like tab hopping or obviously doom scrolling. All of this keeps your brain in a chaotic reactive mode rather than a creative integrative one where it's calm and can think on its own properly. Now, here's what's really happening conceptually. Mind wandering is part of something that psychologists call incubation. Incubation is when you stop consciously working on a problem, and by stopping, you allow your brain to process it differently. When you disengage from forced focus, your brain starts making unexpected connections between distant ideas. It's quietly reorganizing the problem, exploring alternative pathways, and returning to it with a fresh angle that you couldn't access yourself when you were in a tense and locked in mode. And neuroscience backs this up in a really interesting way. Studies using fMRI have shown that creative thinking can strengthen connectivity between the default mode and executive control networks. In other words, creativity isn't just random imagination, it's your internal imagination system collaborating with your goal-directed system. So ideas aren't just wild, they can actually become usable. And that's why mind wandering correlates with higher originality and better divergent thinking, uh, like on tasks where people are asked to come up with multiple uses for a single object. People who can slip into this internal exploratory mode tend to generate more novel and less obvious answers that are more creative and innovative. So it's quite amazing. I mean, by doing something as simple as letting your brain go idle, you can increase your creativity, because idle doesn't mean inactive. It just means internally active. My second tip for you is to think like a child again. Reclaim exploration. Children are creative machines. They explore constantly. Their brains are aggressively taking in information from their environment and trying to build a model of how the world works. And that constant exploration feeds creativity circuits nonstop. This is why kids are naturally creative. They scribble without caring if it's good. They build random things with things like Lego. They invent stories. They make up their own vocabulary even sometimes. They treat reality like something flexible. There's a neurodevelopmental reason for this, actually, and that's that the prefrontal cortex in children is still very much immature. And since the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in planning, in inhibition, and self-monitoring, a less developed prefrontal cortex means that the child brain is less controlled and less censored. So kids think less like managers and more like explorers. They're more playful with their ideas. They're less afraid of failure. They're far more willing to entertain unlikely possibilities without shutting them down. Research also suggests that children and adolescents, they show more widespread activity in networks like the DMN, consistent with the fact that they live in imagination and wonder far more than adults do. And honestly, adulthood often does kill that. Much of life becomes routine. Everything feels known, and that loss of wonder is one of creativity's biggest threats. This, of course, doesn't apply to everyone, but it is certainly a trend between youth and adulthood. So this brings us to the question, how do adults bring that back? How do they reignite their creativity? You basically have to reintroduce novelty and low stakes exploration into your life on purpose. Ask what if questions constantly, not because you're confused, but because you're trying to reopen space for possibility in your brain. Think about the first time you saw a new place, learned a new word, or realized something profound about nature or the universe that you didn't know about before. That feeling of awe, that intense curiosity and fascination that accompanies it, that's creativity at its best, really. That's a creatively friendly brain state. And adults lose it because we stop feeling surprised by the world. We stop exploring the way that we used to. So a practical trick is to simply switch your environment, take a new path to work, rearrange your space, learn a new skill, any skill that's unrelated to your main work, try a new genre of music, talk to someone outside of your field. All of these shifts make your brain feel like it's encountering novelty again. And novelty forces the brain into learning mode. And learning mode is tightly linked to creativity. So the goal is to regain that early life feeling where the mind is open, less noisy, and constantly absorbing information. Because the more open and learning oriented your mind is, the more likely it is to make those fresh combinations that produce novel ideas. This is how you reclaim childlike neuroplasticity, not by becoming childish, but by becoming curious again. Now, my next tip is to avoid perfectionism at all costs. I want to say this in the clearest way possible. Perfectionism is not excellence. They do not go hand in hand in any way. It's not a quest for the best. In fact, it's often a pursuit of the worst in ourselves, the part that keeps whispering that nothing is good enough and that we should redo everything forever. Kids don't create like that. They scribble freely, fearlessly, and like they don't think about getting judged by others. They don't censor themselves the way that adults do. They're very they're in an exploratory mode, and they don't care what others think about them when they do something. They And weirdly enough, this lack of censorship is actually why their creations can be so original, because their abstract ideas are expressed in a way that doesn't make them want to make it correct, in a sense. They don't focus on what's correct and what's wrong, or what's perfect and what's imperfect. They just do things without thinking about it way too much, like adults do. And neurologically, perfectionism activates a brain region called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DACC, which is heavily involved in error detection and self-monitoring. And that makes sense, because if you're obsessed with doing everything the right way, your brain starts scanning for mistakes constantly. It becomes hypervigilant. And the problem with this is, when the brain is in an error scanning state, it diverts attention and energy away from divergent thinking and idea generation. Instead of exploring, it starts policing. Instead of producing possibilities, it starts narrowing down everything way too early. And on top of all this, perfectionism tends to suppress DMN activity and lock you into an executive control mode driven by the prefrontal cortex, which prioritizes rigid goal pursuit, planning, and structure. But creativity is flexible, creativity is unconstrained, and rigidity suffocates that. And perfectionism doesn't stop at cognition, really. It becomes emotional at one point. When perfectionism turns into self-criticism, it can activate the amygdala and insula, ramping up fear, specifically fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of looking stupid. And then your stress system kicks in. Cortisol increases, and that whole cascade makes creativity even harder. So you essentially get into this nasty neurological loop where you try to be perfect, and then your brain starts scanning for errors, so you feel threatened. Therefore, your stress increases, your brain becomes more risk avoidant, and risk avoidance, guess what, is the opposite of creativity. Creativity requires you to tolerate imperfection. It requires experimentation. It requires messy drafts and messy thinking. Nothing in the world is perfect. Nothing is meant to be perfect. So the demand that your creative output must be perfect is nothing but a neurological trap. So instead of asking yourself, how do I make this flawless? The better creative question is, how do I make this real and then improve it over time? That mindset protects your DMN and keeps your brain open instead of defensive. Let's talk about the power of stepping away, especially through sleep. A huge amount of creativity happens during rest, and this is explained once again by the incubation effect, when your brain keeps working on problems without your conscious awareness. During the slow wave and rapid eye movement stages of sleep, the brain consolidates memory and reorganizes circuits, forming novel associations between ideas that previously felt unrelated to each other. So essentially, REM is very creativity friendly because the environment shifts. The limbic and memory systems like the hippocampus are highly active. The prefrontal control regions can be less dominant and there are oscillatory dynamics like theta activity that support unusual associative processes. So this state makes the brain more likely to form loose, unexpected connections. And a great concept that explains this is spreading activation, which is where neural activity spreads through semantic networks across the brain, reaching distant nodes of memory and recombining them together. So you're not consciously steering it, but your brain is still traversing knowledge networks in the background, building novel connections between different areas of the brain subconsciously without your full attention. So incubation is not pausing creativity. No, it entails switching to a different creative mode, one that becomes possible essentially when you stop consciously forcing the solution. You let your brain do its magical internal work. Now let's talk a bit about dopamine, this beautiful molecule. In relaxed exploratory states, dopamine tends to support cognitive flexibility, which is your ability to shift perspectives and generate new ideas. That flexibility is absolutely central to divergent thinking. But balance matters. Keep in mind, balance matters. Too little dopamine is not good for creativity because it means that thinking becomes rigid and unmotivated, while too much can make thinking chaotic and disorganized. Creativity thrives in the middle, in the Goldilocks zone, where dopamine supports exploration without destroying coherence. And this leads us into cross-modal learning. When you expose your brain to multiple sensory modes, visual, auditory, tactile, movement-based, you forge new connections across different networks. And this happens especially in the association cortices, like the parietal and temporal lobes, that integrate different types of inputs. Creative thinkers often show strong creativity between sensory areas and higher order executive regions, meaning that they can move between abstract concepts and vivid sensory imagination fluidly. And here's a practical tip. Draw a concept instead of writing it. Move your body to represent an idea. Listen to music while brainstorming. Use physical metaphors. Remix modalities. That's literally training your brain to synthesize disparate inputs, which is a hallmark of creativity and neuroplasticity in action. So let's bring it home. Your brain is not lacking creativity. It's just often trapped in the wrong mode. If you want creativity to show up more, you need to make your brain a place where creativity can actually thrive. Give it low stimulation time so the DMN can integrate ideas. Reintroduce wonder and novelty like a child again. Stop perfectionism from constantly hijacking your error monitoring systems. Respect sleep and incubation as a legitimate creative process. Keep dopamine in a balanced exploratory state and train cross-modal integration so your brain builds richer neural networks over time. And I'll leave you with a challenge that you can start today. Choose one problem you've been forcing, then step away intentionally. Walk, shower, do dishes, free write, doodle, do the laundry, whatever, any of those things that I mentioned in this presentation. Keep a notepad nearby, this is very important, and let your brain do the internal work that it was designed to do. Because when you liberate your mind, when you stop choking it with noise and control, you start feeling something powerful. The brain becomes a creative engine again, the creative engine that it is meant to be. Thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now.